the sorceress, the witch, she worked some of her magic on them, and she said, may you all transform into hideous birds. But as the spell fell upon those 11 princes, because their hearts were so good and pure, that it didn't quite work the way that she'd intended, and they transformed into birds, but into graceful and majestic swans, each with a golden crown on its head. And with a long, mournful cry and a wiggling of their swan necks, up they went into the air and across the land, and they even flew over the little peasant hut where Eliza was staying, but nobody knew at the time. It was birds passing in the night. And they went to a far distant forest across the ocean, and we'll come back to them in a little bit. Meanwhile, the years pass. Eliza is having her very unpleasant foreign exchange, and she turns 15. And 15 is the age when she is to be presented at court. So no matter what the Queen says, she must come back. So the Queen thinks, what can I do to make sure that she falls out of favour with the King? I've got the perfect idea. So she goes and sets up the royal bathhouse, and she takes into the royal bathhouse 3 toads, boop, 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 one on top of the other like that. And she takes the first toad and she says, you are going to sit on Eliza's head while she has her bath, and she will become as spotty and as wrinkled as you are. Into the bath. And she took the second one and said, you are going to sit on her shoulders so that her back becomes all slunched and hunched like a grumpy teenager. In you go. And you, the last one, you are going to sit on her heart, and you are going to make her heart as cold and as chilled and as clammy as you are. Into there. And then she brought Eliza into the bathhouse and said, my dear, you must bathe, you must prepare yourself to see your father. Eliza stepped into the water where the 3 toads were swimming, but like her brothers, she was so good and pure of heart that the magic of the spell was changed, and as the toads tried to climb onto her head and onto her back and onto her chest, they transformed into poppies and floated off in the air. And the Queen went, oh! Oh no. Well, if that didn't work, I've got an even better spell than that. And she brought Eliza out and went, Eliza, now, you have to understand, you're 15. You're basically a woman now. And I'm going to introduce you to something that really your mother should have introduced you to, but I will do my very best. And she brought out her makeup box. Oh, and the tricks and the sorceries that she worked. By the time Eliza came out, she was several shades more orange than she had been. Massive false eyelashes, lips out to here, the hair all up on top like this, cleavage, tiny short skirt, clattery heels, long nails. And she came into the court, and the King looked at her and went, what has happened? Where is my darling girl? You are clearly some imposter. Get out! I never want to see you again. And Eliza, absolutely distraught, clattered back out of the palace and off out across the land, over the hills, over the mountains, until she found herself in a dark, dark wood where she sat by a pool and she washed the makeup off of her face and she cried. She cried for the family that she had lost. She cried for her mother. She cried for her brothers. And as she sat there by that pool, an old woman came hobbling through the trees with a great big basket full of berries. She sat down next to her and said, you know, when I've been crying, what I find makes things much better is a handful of berries. Would you like some? And Eliza said, and she had some berries with the old woman. And it was true, these berries seemed to lift her spirits even more than she had imagined. It was like a warm glow was spreading up from her tummy into her heart, and her spirits were lifted. And she spoke to the old woman and she said, I know it's silly. I don't suppose that maybe you've seen 11 princes anywhere around here? And the old woman said, well, I've not seen 11 princes, but I have seen 11 swans with little golden crowns on their heads. They fly down to the water's edge not far from here every evening at the height of summer, and if you go down this night, you might just find them. So Eliza made her way out of the woods and down to the seashore. And she watched as the sun set, and just as the rays were starting to disappear over the horizon, she saw flying towards her 11 beautiful swans, each with a tiny cute little crown on its head. And they landed on the seashore, and as the sun dipped below the horizon and it became night, they transformed into their human forms, back into the 11 forms of her brothers, the princes. And they were delighted to see each other. There were tears and hugs and kisses and a great grand reunion as they explained what had happened. And they said, "We have been transformed so that we must be swans while the sun is in the sky, but then at night time we turn back into our human form." Now, the Queen sent out hunters to try and capture us, so we flew across the sea to a far land, but we miss our homeland so much, and we hoped we might see you again. So at the height of summer, when the days are at their longest, we fly in swan form all the way back, but we can only stay for a couple of days of the year when the sun is at its longest, around midsummer. And Eliza listened to her brothers and said, "Well, is there any way that I could come back with you? Because if we're all there together, maybe I can find a way to cure this curse that's been put upon you." And so they thought. And the next day, when she came down to the water's edge to meet the swans, they landed in front of her, and they had brought with them a great big net. And so the next day, just before dawn, they all came and gathered, and Eliza got into the middle of the net, and then all of her brothers ringed around the edge, and as the sun came up, they transformed into their swan forms. Each of them grabbed a piece of the net in their beak, and it must have been quite a sight. 11 swans lifted this net with this young girl in the middle of it, and they flew. They flew across the ocean with Eliza carried safely between them, and they got to the far edge of that distant land just in time as the sun was beginning to set. Boom, 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 boom. And as they landed, they transformed back into their princely forms and said, come with us, let us show you where we live." They found themselves, they took Eliza to what they had found, a little cave not too far from the beach that was good and dry and had a high roof, and here they could set up their campfires, and this was where the brothers lived for most of the year. They would fish in the sea, they would get their food and sustenance from the forest, and Eliza now lived happily with her brothers, at least while they came back in the evenings, and the days she spent walking through the forest trying to think of how she could solve this problem, how she could lift the curse from her brothers. Now one day as she was walking through the woods, she came across an old woman carrying a great big basket full of berries, and she had to do a double take. And "That's very strange. I've travelled across an ocean, but I could swear that I've met you before." And the old woman looked up at her and smiled and said, "You've probably met my sister. There are a few of us all around the world. We all look very alike. That's because we are wise women. How can I help you, my dear?" And Eliza said, "Well, my brothers have been transformed into swans, and I'm trying to work out a way that I can change them back. Do you think maybe you could help?" And the old woman said, "Yes, the old transformed into swans curse. Yes. Seen that used on a few exes in my time. It's a nasty one, that. Now, there is a way to fix it, but it's quite a difficult undertaking. I want you to listen to all of it before you agree to do it, because it is a hard task and it might be a long one." "All right," said Eliza. "Now, in order to change your brothers back into their previous forms so that they will stay as human, you must make them each a shirt made from nettle fibres. And not just any nettles. These nettles must be collected from graveyards. They must be collected by your hand, they must be treated by your hand, and your hands will sting and blister as you collect these. And from the moment that you begin your task, from the moment that you grasp that first nettle, no matter how long the job takes you, if it be days or weeks or even years, from the moment you grasp that first nettle till the final shirt is completed and thrown upon your brothers, you may not speak a word. If you say a single word before the task is complete, it will be like a dagger in your brothers' hearts, and they will all drop down dead wherever they are." Gosh, high stakes indeed. But Eliza loved her brothers, and she was the only one who could break this curse, so she agreed that she would do it. She got directions to the nearest graveyard and went and gathered up as many armfuls of stinging nettles as she could bear to hold, and the old woman was right. They blistered her fingers, and the blisters crept up her arms until her whole body felt like she was walking through fire, and she made her way back to their little cave, and she beat out the long nettle stalks and pulled out the fibres from inside and began to comb them until they were like silken hair, and then spin them into threads ready to turn into the shirts. And when her brothers came back that evening and transformed out of their swan forms, they came to speak to her. "How are you, Eliza? What are you working on?" And slowly they managed to work out that she was doing something very important, and she couldn't tell them what it was. She couldn't tell them anything, but also she was very hungry, and could they get her some food? And so the brothers sat by her throughout the evening, making sure that she was fed and watered, and one by one they went to sleep. But the youngest brother, who had always had a soft spot in his heart for Eliza, sat by her all night, all the time. Even when his brothers had gone to sleep, he stayed by her side, keeping her spirits up, telling her stories from their childhood and little nursery rhymes, until the sun came up and they transformed back into swans, and off they went. Now Eliza had run out of the nettles that she had been using. She had to go and collect some more. She had made at this point about a shirt and a half. This was good, but she needed to go and get more supplies. Off she went back to the graveyard. And as she was collecting up her armfuls and armfuls of this stinging bounty, she suddenly heard noise behind her, barking and howling, and as she turned, she saw a pack of hunting dogs, and before she could even think to run, she saw that the graveyard was surrounded by horses, men on horseback, a great hallooing and shouting and blowing of horns. She had found herself in the middle of a hunt. And not just any hunt, for as she looked, she saw that there was one shining young man in fine clothes on the top of a mighty charger, and he had a noble bearing about him. He came towards her and said, "Young maiden, what are you doing there? Can we help you? Are you in distress at all?" And the prince, for surely it was the prince, looked down and he saw her blistered and raw hands and said, My dear, this is awful. You've injured yourself badly. Come back with me to the palace. We have wonderful physicians. We can take care of you. We can tend to your wounds." Now, I understand that you're scared. Look at us, great big group of strapping, burly men, but you have to understand, I'm the prince, you know. I own this whole land, and I would never let harm come to you. Come to the palace. We'll make sure that you're put up in a fine room. We'll give you a fine dress to wear, and we will tend to these poor hands of yours. My dear, I understand that you're very worried, but trust me, you'll thank me later. And he picked her up and put her on the back of his horse, and off they went back to the palace. And true to his word, she was cared for and looked after. Ointments were put onto her hands to soothe her raw skin, and she was dressed in fine dresses and put up in a fine room in a tower. And Eliza wept and wept, for she didn't know where her brothers were, she didn't know how to get back, and she certainly didn't know what had become of the work that she had been doing. And after a week of sort of continuous sobbing, the prince, who had tried his very best, he'd brought in entertainers and books and fine beautiful things to see if these might please this girl who would not speak to him, sent his groundskeepers out to the place where they had found her, and one of them found the cave and found the pile of nettle fibres, found the unfinished shirts, and brought them back. I think these are from your home. Maybe these will remind you of happier times. And when Eliza saw her work before her, her face lit up, and she got back to work as fast as she could, getting the second shirt done and finished, and on to the next one. And the prince was so cheered to see a smile brought to this young girl's face, and he would come and sit by her and watch her work, watch the threading and the plaiting of the fibres into these sort of very rough spun shirts. But it was a soothing thing. You know how it is a soothing thing to watch someone who's completely absorbed in their work, and he would sit by her and talk to her of matters of state, and although she wouldn't speak to him, she did smile and would look and was clearly listening to him and would sometimes nod or shake her head and would laugh at his jokes. And amazingly, some sort of fondness began to grow between the two of them, even in that silence. But the nettles ran out, and at this point she was maybe halfway through her jerkins that she was making. She had to get more, and she could only get nettles from graveyards. So she worked out with a little bit of miming and signing from the kitchen girls how she could get to the city graveyard. Oh, and the city graveyard, very different from the graveyards in the country. Here in the city, the graveyards were full of vampires, and the vampires were meta. The vampires would sit on the top of the graves completely naked, and they would pull up the dead bodies and peel the flesh off the bones and chew on the flesh. And poor Eliza had to make her way through these graveyards with all the vampires. Come and play! And gather up her armfuls of nettles to come back and carry on with her work. And at this point, with the batch of nettles that she gathered from the city graveyard, she made it about 3/4 of the way through the work. She knew she would have to go and get another load, even though the city graveyard was such a repugnant place to be. And the Archbishop noticed that this young girl was making her way down to the city graveyard. And the Archbishop had noticed that this young girl, who didn't speak, who had appeared suddenly as if out of nowhere, had been put up in a good room in the castle, had been given fine clothes. The prince was talking to her a lot, like a lot for a girl who doesn't talk. We didn't know where she came from, we didn't know what her intentions were, and now she was going down to the city graveyard and no doubt cavorting with vampires in the night and coming back with great armfuls of nettles. And the Archbishop thought and went, "Witches! It's witchcraft! Of course it's witchcraft! Why didn't I see it before? It all lines up! You know, the big murder war with all the different things, all the strings, of course it's witches! It's witches!" And so he went and told the prince, I'm terribly sorry, Your Highness. I know that you think that you're in love with this girl. Unfortunately, it's a spell. She's evil. She's in league with the vampires. And I'm sure if you take this relationship any further, it's all going to end very badly indeed. I'm terribly sorry to bring you this news. And the prince said, "Don't be ridiculous. This young girl isn't going down to the graveyards at night." And so the bishop took him out that evening. And they watched at the gates of the graveyard as Eliza went in, and they could see in the distance, and out she came with her armfuls of nettles. And the prince went, "Well, it must be true. There is no other explanation for why she could be going into that graveyard and coming out with all these nettles. I can't believe it. I've been deceived. Well, there's nothing for it. We're going to have to put her to death." So he came up to the tower the next day to tell her the awful news. I'm so sorry, my dear. I'm so sorry that you have deceived me so badly. I feel really badly for it. I really do. It must be the spell. But I'm going to have to put you in the dungeon, and tomorrow we're going to have to tie you to a stake and burn you. I can't do this. I'm so sorry. And so, as the custom in the palace dictates, she was thrown into the dungeon, and thank goodness, all of her work was thrown in with her as well. She had 10 and a bit jerkins there, and she was almost out of nettles, but she was frantically trying to make it spread as much as she could. This was going to be a very sheer top, this last one. And it got to the middle of the night, the moon high in the sky, and now she couldn't lie even to herself anymore. There was no more nettle. She had almost all of the last jerkin, but the final sleeve. And she sat on the cold floor and she wept and wondered what she would do the next day. Well, the sun rose And she was taken from the cell, gathering all of the jerkins that she had close to her. She was put on the back of a cart and taken through town to where the great pole had been erected with all the firewood underneath. And she was made to stand there while a long list was read of the terrible sexy enchantments that she had done upon the prince. And all the while, Eliza stood there with her arms full of nettle shirts, looking to the skies, hoping and wishing and praying. And then, out of the bright sunlight came the beating of 11 mighty pairs of wings, and down out of the sky came the 11 swans, each with a golden crown on their head, and they formed a protective circle around Eliza with their wings up. And if you've ever seen a swan with its wings up, you know nobody is messing around with that. The space cleared, and there, with their wings up, it couldn't have been a more perfect moment. Eliza quickly grabbed the jerkins and one by one pulled them over the swans, going round all the way 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 3/4. Let's hope that it works. And the golden Disney sparkles began to spiral, and the scene erupted in blinding golden light, and when everybody could look again, there stood not 11 swans, but 11 fine young princes, and the youngest with 1 swan wing. Close enough. And they went, it worked, the spell is broken. And Eliza, seeing that her work was finished, took a great breath and cried, "I'm bloody innocent!" and fainted in her brother's arms. And to prove her innocence, the church bells all through the kingdom began ringing of their own accord, and the sky was filled with every kind of bird, singing in jubilation of the job well done. Vultures and flamingos, everything. It was amazing. And so the prince, seeing this amazing sight and hearing the story now that Eliza could finally tell him, said, my dear, you have been through such hardship, you have shown such determination and courage. I would be honoured if you would offer your hand in marriage to me, but I understand after everything that you've been through. And Eliza went, you know what? I'm going to go home with my brothers, and I'm going to spend some time with my family first, but maybe we could stay in touch and see how things go. He said, I'd like that very much. Trade delegations. And so off they went, her and her brothers, on a boat this time, across the ocean and back to the kingdom that they had called their home as children. And they came to find their father, and found that in the intervening time, the queen, the evil sorceress, had died. Her heart had twisted up in bitterness and puffed into a little pile of cinders, and she had fallen down dead. And so they explained what had happened and the injustice that had been done to them, and a great reunion was had, and they all, as far as I know, are living happily still. Thank you very much, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amelia, Armande! That was fab. Weird, but fab. I've never heard that story before.
That's Hans Christian Andersen for you.
Yeah, good lord. Okay, let's turn these guys into swans. Why? No reason, we'll get there, that's fine. Okay, come back in half an hour. I'm just thrown by this is great. I was like, throughout every story, I try and make mental notes so I can come out and say something pithy or witty and go, well, here's the moral we've learned. What moral was there for that? You can shirk your magic jerkins. It doesn't matter. One-armed swan brother. I want to hear his story. Great. Okay. So this brings us to our second teller, because that is how I'm reliably informed numbers work. And so, Amy, can you please tell us who has the unenviable task of following you?
Oh, Marina.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for an old established favourite. Please give a warm Ropetackle Storytellers welcome to the wonderful Marina Evans.
Unenviable task indeed, follow that. Well, I'll try. I warn you now, ladies and gentlemen, I make no apologies for the fact that this story is going to contain some audience participation.
Yeah.
Please be prepared. It was once said, many hundreds of years ago, that the furthest eastern range of the nightingale was right in the middle of China. And although it was rare to see a nightingale in China, it was thought a very auspicious thing to see one, and even more auspicious to have the pleasure of listening to it sing. And so it was that when a nightingale landed in the woods outside the Emperor's porcelain palace, all of the locals found a moment in their day to go and listen to it. But nobody dare admit that they'd taken a bit of time out of their work in the fields to go and do so. The Emperor was a portly man by this stage. He was comfortable in his porcelain palace that glowed at sunrise and sunset. He was surrounded by the best of paintings and art and treasures, and he was comfortable occasionally walking the very well-manicured grounds, but he never set foot outside the walls of the compound. A visitor came with the most wonderful book, a prized collection listing every treasure in the empire, all of the art, all of the statues, all of the great and beautiful buildings, the wonderful flowers, the well-known songs. And on a page where the Emperor's attention stopped, the song of a nightingale. The Emperor hadn't heard the song of a nightingale, and like a jealous collector, absolutely insisted that he wasn't going to miss out on this treasure of his empire, thank you very much, and he sent every courtier in the building to go and bring him the song of a nightingale, otherwise they'd find themselves a head shorter by the end of the week. Well, the court scattered into hurriedness, and the vizier, a wise and pale man who thought it very sensible not to leave the library, frankly, asked every staff member he could find whether any of them had seen or heard a nightingale, and not one of the staff would admit it. Apart from the little pot-scrubbing girl who said, "I know where the nightingale is, but I'll have to show you." And so the unlikely pair made their way out of the compound, out through the manicured gardens, and out into the countryside. The vizier did not know what was going on. It was wild, it was untamed, nothing was growing in straight lines. He was lost. But the little girl happily skipped on ahead, occasionally beckoning him over, and they came to a river. The vizier stopped at the edge of the river, and he heard the sound of a Yangtze River dolphin. Ladies and gentlemen, would anyone like to volunteer to make the sound of a Yangtze River dolphin? Beautiful. Wonderful.
Atlantic dolphin.
And the vizier stopped. The vizier stopped and said, "That's the strangest, most wonderful sound I've ever heard." "Is that the sound of the nightingale?" And the girl said, "No, that's a dolphin. Come on, this way." On they went, and the river turned a corner and they found themselves walking along into a field, and it was a field full of great long-horned cows. Would anyone like to produce the sound of a long-horned cow? Oh, that's a beautiful herd of cows, and the vizier, being a man of books and indoors, hadn't really heard the sound of a cow. "That's the strangest noise I've ever heard. Is that the song of a nightingale?" "No, that's cows." And she hurried him along. The river took another bend, and it was getting shallower, and the day was getting warmer, and on the edge of the river there was a long, scaly, green crocodile grunting to itself in the sunlight. Would anyone like to do the wonderful sound of a great, green, scaly crocodile? Oh, nice. I think it needs its sinuses checking, but brilliant. Well, the vizier bent down and said, "That's the most unusual thing I've ever heard. Is that? No, that's a crocodile. And what's your feet?" The vizier and the little girl came to the edge of the woods. And in the edge of the woods, there was just the gentle sound of the old blackbird, the occasional robin. And the girl said, "It'll be this tree here." And she walked up to the tree and said, "Hello, Mr. Nightingale. Would you like to sing for us?" Well, the nightingale is a consummate performer. He popped along a couple of branches, puffed out his chest, And I'm not going to ask you to imitate the sound of a nightingale, because nightingales are unique. Everyone sounds different, and every time one sings, it sounds different to the last time. But the most wonderful, warbling, trilling, buzzing sounds came from this little brown-grey bird. And although the vizier wasn't very impressed with its plumage, once the bird had opened its mouth, he was entranced. And he said to the tiny little bird, "Well, you must come to the Emperor's palace. He demands to see you." Nightingale said, "I'm not keen on your tone, mate, but a gig's a gig." And down he went. The nightingale flew alongside the vizier and the girl until they were finally back at the palace. And the nightingale sang for the Emperor. The court was silent. You could hear a pin drop, and every note rang against the porcelain walls. The Emperor had never been so enraptured. The second the last note died away, the Emperor said, "Sing again." The nightingale did, and tears welled up in the Emperor's eyes. He fumbled around his person and looked around the chairs and around the palace and around all the bits of his throne, and he said, "I must give you something, I must give you something. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." And the nightingale said, "The tears in your eyes are all the thanks I could ask for." "Well, you must stay," said the Emperor. The nightingale agreed, and he stayed, and he sang in the court. For many months he gave concerts and recitals, and he popped up and down the court, and he jumped on people's shoulders, and he sang, and he was allowed 3 walks a day, 2 in the day, 1 in the night, and he was guided around by a little string, which was quite interesting. Poor bird. And then one day, a package arrived at the palace, and it had, "To my brother Emperor, yours, the Emperor of Japan." And inside a great ornate cloth was a shining silver and bronze mechanical nightingale. It was covered in jewels, and it glistened in the light, and it was wound with a key. It sang beautifully, but unlike the real nightingale, the mechanical nightingale sang the same song every time. Oh, and it became a chart-topping hit. Everyone in the palace could hum this tune. They could learn it. Hear it 2 or 3 times and you learn the tune. Well, the real nightingale was all right, I suppose, but you never know what that one's going to come out with. This guy, every time, same time. Well, the Emperor said, "Why, my nightingale friend, why don't you sing?" My mechanical nightingale, and the 2 of them were put in a room full of courtiers and full of invited members of the kingdom. And when they sang together, it was awful. The clash and the jar, as the poor little nightingale tried to improvise around a mechanical box that always sounded the same. And the nightingale just thought this wasn't really his kind of thing. And without anyone paying much attention, he flew away. Now, the mechanical nightingale became the star of the court. It travelled around the court, and when it wasn't travelling around the land in great finery and splendour and concerts, it sang the Emperor to sleep. Every night it would be wound with the key, and there it would sing its song, and so repetitive it was that the Emperor could fall asleep to it, bathed in its lovely mechanical music. And then one night, with the turn of the key, it went whir, and boing, and clunk. Well, the watchmakers of the land gathered round the mechanical nightingale with their jewelled glasses and their tweezers and their stethoscopes, and they shook their heads and they sighed. The mechanical nightingale had been wound so much that it was terribly broken. They concluded that if the Emperor wanted to hear exactly the same song again, he would have to leave winding it only once a year. The Emperor placed it on his bedside shelf and grew sad. He grew sad, and then he grew sick, and then he started to feel how old he was. And he couldn't hear his music anymore, and he didn't have his real nightingale friend either. And the years passed by, and the Emperor was lying in his bed one night, in a silent room, as all the courtiers had quietly shuffled away, wondering about the Emperor's health. And he looked up from his covers and looked to the end of his bed, and there he saw Death, wearing his crown, playing with his slippers, twirling his sceptre over his head like a baton, and wrapped in the flag like a superhero cape. And the Emperor had just enough strength in his body to say, "Bring me music, please!" And Death was having none of it. Death brought his own kind of music. Death brought all of the voices of the people the Emperor had forgotten. Death brought all the regrets, all of the sadnesses, all of the mistakes, all of the wrong choices, and all of those voices echoed up and down the porcelain walls of the palace. Now, the Nightingale had heard how sick the Emperor had become, and he had been flying back to the palace for some time. He landed on the windowsill and heard this echoing of sad and terrible sounds, and he began to sing his unique song, that song that was never quite the same twice. And Death, just for a moment, turned and looked, and he listened. He said, "Oh, go on, do it again." And the Nightingale went, "Only if you take off the crown and undo that and put that down, and you can stop playing with those slippers right away." Well, Death put those things down. The Nightingale said, "And you can leave the Emperor alone. He's not ready to die yet. He'll learn from his mistakes. Off you go, leave him alone." And Death sat there for just a few minutes more as the Nightingale sang. And he sang the Emperor back into happiness. He sang of all the joy of the land. He sang of all the spring growth. He sang of the flowers and the fields and the people and the love and the laughter. And soon the Emperor was feeling much better, and Death was nowhere to be seen. Nor were any of the courtiers, of course, because they'd all done a bunk thinking they were going to have a change of regime before the morning was up. And the Emperor sat lonely in his palace apart from his little bird friend, and he said, "How can I thank you? You've saved my life." And the Nightingale said, "You don't need to thank me. You've already been a wonderful audience. Just let me come and visit." The Emperor said, "You must live here." "No, that's where we went wrong last time. I will come and sing to you of all the joy of the land, and I will sing you of the sorrows as well. You must hear those. But we shall do this quietly. No one must know you have a little bird friend." And so it was that when the first of the courtiers sneaked back into the palace, thinking that the worst had happened, and poked their head round the Emperor's door, the Emperor had sat up, a little flutter of wings out of the window, and the Emperor said, "Good morning." And that was where the story ended.
Thank you so much, Marina. Ladies and gentlemen, Marina Evans. All right. Well, thank you very much. Following the grand tradition of audience participation, this is our last story of the first half. Oh, that wasn't the reaction I was going. Great. Well, the good news is our last story of the first half, which means you can all run to the bar. So, we got time for one more? Am I doing this? Excellent. Great. In which case, I'm gonna round us off, and this will be the last of the erstwhile Worthing Storytellers, and then we have guests, special guests, incredible guests, 2 guests who have come from a distant storytelling club, further afield than Worthing, if that is possible to believe. These guys have come all the way from Brighton. I know. And we have the wonderful Lunarsea Storytellers. But I've stalled long enough, and I now have to decide what I'm going to tell. So, let's go. Okay. This story starts, as all good stories start, in Babylon. And this is not Babylon as it is today. This is Babylon as it once was. Babylon in times of greatness. Babylon where golden structures dotted the lands. Babylon where merchants sailed the many seas and came and brought goods, fruits, sandalwood and stories to sell and trade in Babylon, the greatest city on earth. So they said on all the billboards, come to Babylon, spend your money, stimulate the economy. And so in Babylon it was that there were two friends, one whose name was Corvus. Corvus was a pious man. Corvus was a good man. Corvus was a decent man. And being a good, pious and decent man, he sacrificed to the great god of civilization, to the god of the muses, to the god of music, to the god of mathematics and architecture, to Apollo, god of the sun and of the light and of life itself. Apollo of healing, Apollo of learning, Apollo the wise, Apollo the warrior. And he came every year, and because he was a rich man, Corvus would bring 12 oxen and 12 sheep and 12 goats, all to the temple of Apollo in Babylon, and he would slaughter them. And he would say, "Great Apollo, please accept this sacrifice and bless my family and me for the year ahead. Give us good fortune and good harvests." And Apollo on high Olympus saw all this and went, nice. Because Apollo is, someone comes along and they bring you 36 animals and kill them before you're going to take notice, right? This isn't like, here's a sandwich. This was a big deal, and he did it every year. It was reliable. And Apollo quite liked this, and as a consequence, Corvus was one of Apollo's favoured. And he did. He blessed him, and he gave him two beautiful children and 2 others. And he gave him a lovely wife. And they were happily married for 4 years. They'd been married for 40, 36 were fine, but they were happily married for 4 of them. And Corvus thought his life was fairly good. I mean, his life was pretty good, right? He lived in Babylon, one of the greatest cities in the world. He was a favoured of Apollo. He came and gave sacrifices, and Apollo went, nice, every year. Until one day, his friend arrived, and his friend got off the ship, staggering, still a little bit drunk, sweating with his clothes torn, with mud on his face, his hands beaded with dirt, grime, and calluses from a long and arduous journey at sea, and a bag that was as tall as he was, heavier than he was, and filled with gold. And this man's name was Sinbad. And Sinbad arrived, and he went, "That's it. I am never getting on another boat as long as I live." And his mate Corvus came running down and said, "Sinbad, goodness me, you've been gone for, wow, the prologue. Well done. Welcome, Sinbad. Tell me, how many voyages have you been on now?" And Sinbad went, "1, and that's what I'll be famous for. The one voyage of Sinbad. I'm not doing any more." And Corvus went, "Great. Tell me, Sinbad, tell me about your adventure." And Sinbad, "It's not my story, mate. Is everything okay?" Yeah. Good. And Sinbad relayed his first adventure. He said, "I was terrible on a whale, and we didn't know it was an island. It had trees, but it turned out we set a fire. The trees were actually part of a big whale, and the whale went underground. We all drowned, except I didn't drown. A boat came along, whew, and it took me to another island. And I went, 'Oh, thank you, Allah.' And I got off, and the island was full of cannibals. And I went, 'Oh, no, Allah, what have you done?' And Allah went, 'Oh, I'm going to have your friends eaten by cannibals.' And I went, 'No, my friends, I thought they drowned, but they came back just to die.' And then I found another boat, and I got on the other boat, and the other boat took me to a distant kingdom. And in this distant kingdom there were 3 pillars, one of salt and one of sand and one of fire. And there were 3 riddles, and the answers were green, yes, and that's actually my name. And the princess offered to marry me, and I said, 'No, I'll have your weight in gold.' And she was huge, so good choice. And I came back, and this is what I've got." And Corvus went, "Wow, that sounds like a great story. Why aren't we telling that one? Because we haven't got time. It doesn't fit the brief. Feathered folklore. There's no birds in that one." And Corvus went, "Okay, all right, fine. What else do you see, Sinbad?" And Sinbad goes, "Well, I'm glad you asked. Because I went to... Let me get this right. Thank you, where? Hyperborea. What? I went to Hyperborea, the land of the Hyperboreans, where they're not just Borean, they are Hyperborean. Like go to 11 on the Borean scale. they sacrifice to Apollo. And Corvus goes, yeah, they sacrifice to Apollo. Every year, they bring 12 donkeys, and then another 12 donkeys. But then they top it off with 12 donkeys. They sacrifice 36 donkeys to Apollo. Them Hyperboreans do. And he goes, well, maybe that's what Apollo wants. Are they happy? Oh, they're extremely happy. Are they blessed? They are supremely blessed. They are propitious. They are fortunate. They have mountains of gold and piles of grapes and so many children, lovely children, more attractive than your children. Goodness me, Apollo must love them. And he went, well, I guess if Apollo wants donkeys he gets. And so, the next day, because it was conveniently located in this story, the next day, when it was time to make his annual sacrifice to Apollo, of his 12 oxen, his 12 goats, and his 12 cows, he said, no, oxen and goats and cows, that's last year, and all the previous years that worked out really well. We're throwing that away, we're going with donkeys now. That's the latest fad. I've heard that from my mate Sinbad, who's totally sane. Have you met him? And his wife said, are you sure about this? He said, yes, darling, I am. Really sure about this, would you just please, let's not make a scene, okay, let's not. So she went off and she went, okay, fine. She took the goats and the cows and the oxen back, and she came back with 36 donkeys. And she had 12, and she just came back with 36 donkeys. She'd been working out. She had 12, and she gave him 12 to hold. Weird. I mean, rather dead, I suppose, than alive. And his two sons, his two beautiful sons, started walking up towards the great statue of Apollo. Now, Apollo's the god of the sun, so his temples are white alabaster that gleams and glints at noon and refracts off of the marble columns and the golden plinths that are designed to create a visual spectacle for the god of architecture and light. And as the two sons start approaching, Apollo himself descends from the heavens. And can we have some angelic music, please? Apparently not. That's fine. Apollo descends from the heavens. And he arrives in front of Corvus, and Corvus says, My lord Apollo, I have 36 donkeys for you. And Apollo says, The fuck is this? I don't need donkeys. I get donkeys from them weird Borean people. You give me goats and sheep and ox. That's what I want. We have a good thing going here. Donkeys. And Corvus realises he's made a terrible mistake. He goes, I'm so sorry. We won't sacrifice any donkeys to you. Better not. One donkey sacrificed in my name, and I'll do something I'll regret. And that was a promise, right? When God says something, he means that. And so Corvus said, don't worry, I'll take these 12. They will not be sacrificed to you. Wife, what are you doing with those donkeys? Honestly, I told you, please take those donkeys. Take those donkeys and go and get the oxen and the goats and like I said, honestly. And she started taking the donkeys. We'll talk about this. 4 years for a reason. Off she went. And then he said, 12, 24, where are the... No! And he turned, and he couldn't stop himself in time. He couldn't stop his sons, his two beautiful sons. And his other sons were with him, and he said, And his two beautiful sons said, in the name of Apollo, apparently we're from the West Country, so we are. That's what happens. The more beautiful you are, the more westward you go with your accent. And Helen of Troy, she spoke like this. And they slit the throats of the asses, and as the blood fell on the ceremonial knives, and it fell on the floor, and it splattered everywhere, and they weren't very good at it because they were very beautiful, and we know what that means. So they slit the throats, but these donkeys, and it was a horrible sight, braying, and this cacophony of blood and noise, and not quite dead donkeys. And Apollo turned, he's like, the fuck did I just say? What did I just say, Corvus? Oh, I'm so annoyed! Remember what you've got to do, Apollo, and breathe. And count to 4. You are strong. You are in command of your emotions. Your inner child does not rule you. And Apollo took all of his rage. Remember what Athena said, and breathe out, and breathe out. And he took his rage and he sent it into the donkeys. And the donkeys were filled with the madness that a god builds up. The madness of a spurned deity, and the donkeys turned and they started eating Corvus's sons. And Apollo went, oh, that's so much better. And he turned, and he's still bleeding, spraying artillery. And it was horrible. I mean, this was messy. The sacrifice had been bad, but this was properly 18 rated, right? Send your kids to bed. This is grim. Have you ever heard a donkey eating two very thick, very beautiful Greek boys? Because you have. Because it's not a sound you're likely to forget soon. And these donkeys, I mean, they were hopped up. They were divinely enraged. And their veins pulsing on their necks, their horrible braying muted only by more and more of the Greek boys. They managed to... That's exactly the response. And Corvus went, no, my boys, no, please, oh, it's awful, no, Apollo, please. And Apollo went, wow, that's a mess. Oh my goodness me, that looks awful. I probably could have saved them if I'd acted faster. That's not good at all. And Corvus said, oh no, oh my poor boys. And he went to try and pull the donkeys away. But these donkeys, these asses, they were driven mad with rage. And they were foaming at the mouth, and their teeth were like tombstones, grinding against one another with a horrible sound. And his wife came running over and said, no, and tried to pull him away. And his two other children came and tried to pull the donkeys off, but the donkeys turned and ate his other kids as well. And
What's
Corvus
this got to do with birds?
said his wife. You come back here with them oxen and them sheep and we'll find out. And his wife came running over, and you know what? She got eaten as well. Didn't have to, it was spiteful. And Corvus wept. He wept and he wept, and he turned to Apollo and he said, Apollo, have I not been a good and faithful servant to you? Have I not given you sacrifices that have pleased you over the years? Did I not produce fine children and they devoted their lives to you? Have I not erected great temples in your name? Do I not make sacrifices yearly and sing your praises? And I put on that shitty play last year and you liked it. And Apollo said, I see your pain, Corvus. And so he did what gods sometimes do to lift the spirits of a mortal. When they see that mortals are overcome, they're overwhelmed because they're fragile things with a finite and temporary lifespan, they pluck them from their human form and lift them to rise above their pain. This happens all throughout Greek mythology. Every god's done it at least twice, with different people. And Corvus was Apollo's first. And Apollo reached down, he took Corvus and he said, please let me free you from this suffering. And he pulled Corvus up, and Corvus felt his body being pulled up and stretched, and he dropped the reins he was holding, and his cloak spread out behind him, and he was pulled by his head, which began to elongate, his nose stretching out, and his form shifting until he rose as a beautiful white raven. And Apollo said, there, be free from your mortal pain. And Corvus went, wow! And he looked down, and he saw the asses had calmed down, and he saw that his family were all dead. But they were the family of the merchant Corvus, not the family of the raven Corvus. The raven Corvus looked down, and he was aware that these were dead humans. And he was aware that he had been feeling such terrible sorrow for them. But as he looked into the eyes of his dead children, he went, they look really tasty now. And so it was that Corvus joined the asses and ate his family and felt much better about everything. And he was a white raven blessed with the power of prophecy and the ability to just not give a fuck about his family anymore. And he was taken by Apollo to be a protector and a spiritual advisor for him. Because Apollo realized in this moment that he'd messed up. Right, this guy was a faithful servant. He was a good human, but gods and humans, they don't see eye to eye very much. It's just so hard when you're a god because the human lifespan is over like that. You look, it's like, oh wow, I slept with your great grandmother, and suddenly there's somebody else. And so he realised that he would have to try and keep a link to the mortal realm, try and tether himself. And so, because birds are closer to gods than they are to humans, Corvus would act as an intermediary, and Corvus would be eyes and wings and ears on Earth. And because Corvus was a magical raven, the first of its kind, bright white and brilliant, because it was created by Apollo, it could also speak. It had the human tongue. And so, we're going to skip a few. We haven't got time.
We're basically at time there, if you want.
We're at time there?
Yeah.
Do you want more, or should we call it here? Let's call. You know what? We'll see if we want more after the break. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say Corvus was taken. Let's do this one. Corvus was taken by Apollo on the anniversary of his family's death, and he said, "I'm going to make a sacrifice to great Zeus. I'm going to make a sacrifice to great Zeus. I'm going to sit and sing and pour out the libation from the water taken from the holy well. If you take this bucket, go and fetch me water from the holy well, which is over by that tree, all the way over there." And Corvus went, and he looked, and the tree was a long way away, but it was a holy well. "Ah! Go and fetch me water from the holy well. I will pour it out. I will pray to Zeus, and as I am Zeus's sibling, I will ask him to look favourably upon your family. And he is the king of the gods. His power knows no limits. He can intercede with Hades. He can pluck your family from their tragic place in a story and put them in the constellations if he so chooses." And Corvus goes, "All right, you must go, take this golden bucket, fill it with water from the well, bring it back immediately. I will pour it out, sacrifice to Zeus, and we'll see what he does." Corvus goes, "Right. So he takes the bucket, and off he flies, and he flies like an arrow. He flies like a raven. He flies straight across the landscape, and he's going like an absolute machine, straight towards that well. His family are at stake. His place in history is at stake. The stakes are far too high to allow himself to be distracted. He goes past a football match, he goes, "I don't care, I'm not even going to look." He goes past the bookies, and he goes, "I'm not even going in." And he goes past a fig tree with figs that are shriveled and several days ready from being ripe, and he goes, Whoa, figs, you say?" And he stops, and he goes, "Ooh, well, family, salvation, figs. Well, family, salvation, figs. Wrath of an angry god, figs. And he goes, "Hang on, Apollo did something to me last. I can't remember. I'm a raven now." And so he stops and he waits for 1 day and 1 night and 2 days and 2 nights and 3 days and 3 nights pass, and the figs ripen. And Corvus goes, "God, bit of luck that, isn't it?" And he eats every single one. He gorges himself, and his white feathers are stained with a purple juice. And he goes, "Oh, amazing, what was I doing? Well, bucket, that's right, angry god, oh dear." And so he flies over, he grabs the bucket, he dips it in the well, and he goes, "Right." He looks down and goes, "Purple juice, that's no good. Apollo's going to do me here. What am I going to do? I know." And so he plunges into the pool and pulls out what lies in the middle of all magical wells in Greek myths, which is a water snake. We all know that. So he grabs this water snake in one hand, he grabs it in one claw, he grabs the bucket in the other, and straining under the weight, he flies all the way back towards Apollo, who at this point has been forced to find his own magical water, has already done the ritual, and is awaiting Corvus with a less than impressed look on his face. And Corvus turns out and goes, "I got it, Apollo. I got the water. And I've also..." Oh, goodness me, sorry, a bit full. "I've also..." Let me tell you why I'm late, right? You're going to laugh. It was this snake. He holds up a snake that's going... And Apollo looks at the snake and it's like... And he looks at Corvus the raven with figs stained all over his mouth. He says, "I'm going to ask you one time, is that exactly what happened?" And Corvus looks at himself in the reflection in the water and sees the purple around his beak, and he goes, "Yeah, that's exactly what happened. It was a snake. He slowed me down. You, my friend, you're in trouble now. Go, get him, Apollo, get him." And Apollo took Corvus and the serpent and the golden crater, the golden bucket, and he took them and he said, "I did sing to Zeus, and I did libate the ground, and Zeus said that I got to pluck whoever I wanted and put them in the stars, and I am taking all of you." And so he grabbed them and he said, "Let you forever stay there as a lesson to all other creatures never to defy Apollo, the god of the sun. The sun is in the sky in the day, and it will serve as its lesson on its own, and at night let you serve as a warning." He scattered them into the heavens. And the constellations that you can see are Hydra, the great water snake, and atop it, never touching, destined to be just out of reach of a drink for all eternity, are Corvus the crow and Crater the vessel. And if you look up on a night like tonight, you will be able to see low-hanging smog and pollution. But if we were in an area where you could see the stars, you would be able to see them tonight. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our first half. Please, everybody, go downstairs, get yourself, libate yourselves, get yourselves drinks, refreshments, anything you want, and then please come back for the second half, because we have two wonderful storytellers that I'm very excited to share with you when you will return. Once again, thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you in 10 minutes' time. Thank you.
Farmer and his wife. And they had absolutely everything a farmer and his wife could possibly want. They had fertile lands, a lovely comfortable home, they had a fantastic vegetable garden, and they had healthy, happy animals. They had another thing as well, which was that they had a juniper tree in their garden, and a juniper tree is a magic tree. They had everything they could possibly want apart from one thing. What do you think that was?
Little baby.
A little baby. They had plenty of ravens up in the beech trees, but they just wanted a little cute baby because the farmer needed somebody to take over the farm, and the mother, well, she potential mother, she just needed a little baby to play with, but one didn't come along. And so one day, when the snow was falling like feathers from the sky, she went outside and she took with her a black-handled knife and a great big ruby red apple. And she sat beneath the magic tree, the juniper tree, and she peeled her apple and she said, I wish I could have a baby. I wouldn't care, she said. I wouldn't care if its skin was as white as snow. I wouldn't care, she said, if its eyes were as black as this ebony-handled knife. I would not care if its hair was a shock of red like this ruby red apple. I just want a baby. Lo and behold, 9.5 months later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, and his skin was indeed as white as snow, and his hair was a ruby red shock, like red washed plums, and he had these funny little red marks, these little funny little red half moons on his fingers and on his toes, and he had little red dots underneath his eyes. And his eyes were black, jet black. They would suck in the light. And this beautiful baby looked up and loved his mother. And I don't know if it was joy or shock, but 2 days after this little baby was born, the mother died. And the father was plunged into a despair. And after some time, he gathered himself and he found himself another wife. And after some time, they had a little baby, a beautiful little girl with chestnut curls that hung like grapes around her cheeks. And the moment that little girl baby saw her big brother baby, she knew that she loved him in her baby's heart. But the stepmother hated him. She couldn't stand his weird red hair. She hated the way that his eyes would suck her into them. She couldn't stand anything, his weird funny things on his fingers. She could not bear that boy, and she would go into his bedroom at night time and pinch his toes so that he'd have nightmares, and she made him do all of the hard work as well. And she made him dig the vegetable patch, and she made him scrub the floors and clean the windows. But he grew up to be a kind, good boy. And when he was about 12 years old, he came in from school, and he came into the kitchen, and the stepmother was in there doing a bit of washing up. And he said, Mother, could I have an apple, please? And she said, the apples are in the chest. And he went into the larder and opened up this great big chest where they kept the apples, and they were very cold, and there weren't many apples left because it was springtime. And so he heaved up this chest, and he reached far down to find one of these beautiful ruby red apples. And in that moment, the most vicious thought that stepmother had ever had went through her head, and she marched over to the larder, went right in, grabbed hold of the lid when he was bending down like that, and she went, and she cut his head clean off. And then she picked up his little boy body and put it down on a seat in the sitting room. And then she picked up his head and she balanced it on top of his shoulders. And she stretched out his hand and flip, put the apple into his palm. And then the little girl came home from school and she said, Mother, could I have an apple, please? And the mother said, your brother's got an apple. He's in the sitting room. And so the little girl went into the sitting room and said, Brother, could I have an apple, please? And the brother said nothing. His eyes just stared into the distance. And so the little girl went back into the kitchen and said to her mother, Mother, my brother's not speaking to me. And the stepmother said to her, well, if he ignores you again, just give him a little shove like that. And so the little girl went back into the sitting room and said, Brother, could I have a bite of that apple, please? And the brother, he said nothing. His eyes just stared into the distance, and he kept his mouth shut. And so she went up to him and she pushed his shoulder, and his head rolled off his shoulders and into the fire grate, and it was covered with ash. And the stepmother came storming in. Now look what you've done, you stupid little boy. And I haven't got any dinner. Wait a minute. Get down the bottom of the garden and dig me up some carrots and some potatoes. So the little boy went down to the bottom of the garden and did as his stepmother told him to, and he dug up some carrots and potatoes, and he came back into the kitchen and they were all muddy. And the stepmother got hold of her cauldron, and she went to the brook and she filled it up with fresh spring water, and she put it on top of the hearth. And then she got the little boy and she chopped him up like this, and she scraped him into the pot. And then she got the vegetables, the potatoes and the carrots, and she chopped them up, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, a bouquet garni, and she cooked up a beautiful sun stew. And the father came home and he sat down at his place in the table, and the little girl was crying underneath, but he had a spoon and a fork, and his wife dished him up some food and put it on a plate in front of him, and he took his spoon and he put it into the food and that is disgusting, he said. I am not going to eat that. And he said to the little girl under the table, take this outside and bury it. And so the little girl scraped every morsel back into the cauldron. Was it a little girl? Yeah, carried it out, and it was a moonshine night, and she dug a hole underneath the juniper tree, and she buried all of the stew, and then she went upstairs and straight to bed. And that moonshine night, the moonbeams shone through the branches of the juniper tree and down onto the ground, and below the bones moved and wiggled, and one little bone wiggled up through the soil, and another, and one bone jumped on top of that, and then more bones came up, and bone jumped on bone, and skin grew on bone, and flesh beneath the skin, and feathers above the flesh, and there were long skinny legs and a beak, and the little bird flew up in the air and far, far away, all the way to the watchmaker. And the little bird tapped on the watchmaker's window. And the watchmaker opened up their window. And the little bird sang, my mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My little sister buried me under the juniper tree. Kyrie, what a strange bird am I. the watchmaker had tears streaming down their face. You poor thing, is there anything I can do? And the little bird said, yeah, you can make me a gold watch. And so the watchmaker stayed up all night making a beautiful golden watch, and in the morning he threaded the watch on a golden chain and put the chain around the bird's neck, and the little bird flew up in the air and far, far away, all the way to the hat maker, the milliner. And the little bird tapped on the milliner's window. And the milliner opened up her window, and there she saw a little bird, and the little bird sang, my mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My little sister buried me under the juniper tree. Kyrie, what a strange bird am I. And the milliner, tears streaming down his face, you poor little thing, is there anything I can do for you? And the little bird said, yeah, you can make me a hat. And the milliner stayed all night and made a beautiful red felt hat, and in the morning, plonk, put it on the bird's head, and the bird flew up in the air and far, far away, all the way to the windmill. But the sails of the windmill were still, because the men were changing the millstone, and they rolled out the old and they rolled in the new, and our little bird alighted on the old millstone and sang its song, and you can join in with me because you've already heard it twice. My father, no, my mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My little sister buried me under the juniper tree. Kyrie, what a strange bird am I. And the men really wanted to cry because it sounded so beautiful. Thank you. And so they didn't cry because they were men, so they just scratched themselves a lot and elbowed each other quite a lot. And so, what can we do? How can we help you, little bird? You know, what do you expect us to do about it? And the little bird said, you can give me this great big millstone. And they said, what? Don't be stupid, you're just a tiny little bird. And the bird said, yeah, get a big piece of rope, put it through the eye, tie a knot round it, put it over my neck and see me fly. And they were, all right then. So they did that, and the little bird flew up into the air with the millstone trailing around its neck and the red hat and the gold watch, and it flew all the way home, all the way to the house where it lived when it was a little boy. And it was Sunday lunchtime, and the family were below eating their Sunday lunch. And the little bird alighted on the roof, and the little bird sang, my mother, she killed me. And the little girl said, my brother, I can hear my brother. And so she ran out through the over the threshold, and she ran outside, and as she went across the threshold, fadunk, the hat came down upon her head, and she danced around the garden. And the bird sang, my father, he ate me. And the father said, my son, I can hear my son. And he ran out of the house into the garden. As he went across the threshold, stunk, beautiful golden watch. And he saw a little girl, his girl in the garden with her hat on. And he ran over to her and picked her up, and he kissed her on both cheeks. And the stepmother was sitting in the kitchen. She felt a terrible foreboding. And the little bird sang, my little sister buried me under the juniper tree. Kyrie, what a strange bird. And the mother ran out of the house, and the millstone came back down on her head and killed her flat dead. Yes. What a strange bird am I. And in that moment, the juniper tree just burst into flames. And the flames died down, and there was nothing but a charred black trunk. And the farmer got his axe, and he split open the trunk, and inside was the boy. The boy with beautiful white skin and red hair and funny black eyes and funny little marks on his fingers and toes. And the boy and the girl and the dad lived happily ever after. The end.
All right. Thank you so much. Fleur, Shorthouse, everybody! Thank you. What a bloodthirsty audience you are. Goodness me. And somebody died. Yeah! Okay. Well, I don't know how much blood there is in our last story, but I do know that it is our last story. And I also know that I am very proud to be able to announce to you all that we have the wonderful Xanthe Gresham in our midst. Can we please give her a big round of applause? Xanthe Gresham from Lunarsea Storytellers!
I just have to say, you know the Brothers Grimm invented the stepmother? It was always good mother and bad mother. But we do love a bad stepmother. Yeah, we love a bad stepmother. I'm a stepmother and it's become a political cause. For a bit of participation. This is a folk tale from Kazakhstan, which I first came across from Margaret Mead's book, Earth Magic, and I think it's been told a lot. But the participation goes like this: peck, peck, hop, hop, peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on, don't stop, keep on, don't stop. Ready? Peck, peck, hop, hop, peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on, don't stop, keep on, don't stop. Oh, perfect. That's what happens when you go last, isn't it? And then the other thing is really complicated bit of hand percussion. Some trees give fruit and some do not. Poplar, cypress, apricot, pomegranate, peach and mulberry, apple, quince and sweet cherry. There was once a woman. Thank you, that was brilliant. There was once a woman. She happened to be a very, very, very good. Guess what?
Stepmother.
But that's another story. And she had a dream. And it was one of those things, she thought about it when she was looking at everybody. She thought about it when she wasn't looking at anybody, and it seemed impossible, but it also seemed, because her dream was so real, that it was right in front of her. Now, not far away from this woman, there was a shepherd and a farmer, and they were great friends. And life without friendship is nothing. And the shepherd had terrible land, very stony, but great sheep. And the farmer had wonderful land and great fruit. And then all the sheep died of a terrible sickness. And the shepherd came to the farmer and said, I'm going to have to say goodbye. No sheep, no land, needs another job. And the farmer said, no, life without friendship is nothing. Take half my land. Oh, I couldn't do that. You haven't got enough. I've got more than I need. And so they shared. And that was great. So the shepherd came over to the farmer's land and started to dig and found a pot of gold. And he went running to his friend. He said, happy days, happy days, happy days. This is yours. I found it on your land. And the farmer said, no. I gave you that land. It's your gold. No. It's your gold. It's your gold. They started to scrap about whose gold it was. And then they realised, obviously, money causes trouble. So they went to the judge. And the judge had 4 students. And he looked up from his teaching and said, yes. Well, we have a pot of gold here and neither of us want it, so we want you to decide what should be done with the gold. Now, there were 3 male students and 1 female student. You can be all of them. What do you think should happen to the gold? What would you do with the gold?
Give it to the poor.
Give it to the audience. Give it to us, said one of them. Give it to the poor, said another one. That's only two.
Hospital. Build a hospital.
Build a hospital. Yes,
Build a
and
school.
build a school. Yes.
Share it.
Share it. But
Buy 12 donkeys.
yeah. yeah. The girl student was the one with the dream, and she said, "Well, money's no good. It's like manure. You have to spread it. And I have this dream. I've not told anybody about it, but do you mind if I share it with you? Yeah, I had this dream that in the middle of a dusty city, we would have a garden with fragrant fruit and flowering tree, cascades of clematis, walkways in willow, frog on frog, bird on bird, honeysuckle scenting hedges in the sun. Whenever I dream of this garden, it seems to me to be done." And the judge said, "Well, I think she gets the gold." Yes. Yes. Everybody, it was a mutiny. They all said, no, there should be a hospital, there should be school, donkeys, whatever. But no, she got the gold. She got the gold. And the judge said, "A word to the wise: if you go outside the palace of the Khan, there's a marketplace, and you'll get the best seeds there for your garden." So off she went. She took a hill at a step, a higher hill at a stride. She came to the palace of the Khan, and right in front of the palace of the Khan was the best market. Spices, fruits, and of course seeds. So she was just negotiating the best seeds when she heard a cry. It made her spin on her heels, and she realised it was a cacophony that sounded like one cry, and it was coming from a train of camels, so long she could see the first camel but she couldn't see the last, and strapped to these camels were birds by their claws hanging upside down. There were little birds, big birds, and magical birds like the simorgh and the phoenix, and they were screeching because of course they didn't like being attached to camels. And she said to the camel driver, "What are you doing?" And the camel driver said, "These are for the Khan, and they're for his table, and the feathers are to decorate the walls of his palace." And she said, No, I will buy the birds." He looked at her and said, "You silly girl, how could you afford to buy these birds?" But she dressed herself a bit down because she didn't want to be mugged on the way. She had a carpet bag. She opened up the carpet bag. She took out the pot of gold. And the camel driver put it down and started to count and realised it was more gold than even the Khan could give. She said, "I'll just keep one piece if that's okay with you." He said, "Yeah, sure, take one piece." She took one piece. He took the gold. And she thought she'd maybe buy a few seeds with that gold. She put it in her pocket and she started to unstrap the birds. The little birds, the medium-sized birds, the big birds, the magical birds. And for a while, you know how they went. Peck, peck, hop, 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 peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on doing stuff, keep on doing stuff, peck, 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 hop, hop, peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on doing stuff, keep on doing stuff. And most of them went, but some of them were just too sick and too weary and too twisted-winged and too depressed, however birds get when they're hung upside down on a train of camels. So she used her last gold coin to buy them little protective shelters and food and sit with them and protect them from predators. And after a few weeks, they flew. And so did her heart. She went home, taking the hill at the step, the higher hill at a stride, and her heart was, "Oh, what I did for these birds." And then she came to the place where she had always dreamed that her garden would be. I've failed. I was given a pot of gold. I wanted to build a garden. I had my chance. I failed. I just fell into a pool of tears. You all know that feeling. Dreams, literally. But a little robin was listening. And, you know, there is a bird network, a little bit like the mycelium network under the ground, but it's up in the sky. And it wasn't long before the air was alive with the linnet and lark, the croak of the nightjar that creaks through the dark, alive with the siskin, chit-chatter, tee-hee, the quick yellow hammer, bread, no cheese, and of course, the Simorgh, the phoenix. And they landed next to her, and they didn't say anything because generally birds don't speak, they sing. And off the go. Peck, peck, hop, hop, peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on, don't stop, keep on, don't stop, peck, peck, hop, hop, peck, peck, hop, hop, keep on, don't stop, keep on, don't stop. And each of the birds began to put a seed into the ground. And there were ordinary seeds, weeds, plants, and then magical seeds. And then all the birds took flight, and each of them got a beakful of water from somewhere in the world. There was ordinary water, and there was water from the land of dreams. And they brought the water back, and they put it, and then they blew on it with their breath. And because some of these seeds were from the land of dreams, this all happened super fast because the story, it has to happen fast. And underneath the ground, the roots began to tangle. And up, up, up. And there was a garden of fragrant fruit and flowering tree, cascades of clematis, walkways in willow, bud on bud, frog on frog, and birds, wing to wing, honeysuckle scenting hedges in the sun. The garden, the dream of the garden, had just begun because walls grew up around it. And developers came on horseback. They'd smelt the fragrant fruit, and they leaned over the wall, but whenever they tried to grasp the fruit, it just either shriveled or they fell off their horses. And then the shepherd and the farmer and the judge and her 3 student friends came, and they said, "We've called the sick, the thirsty, the hungry, the forlorn, those from war-torn countries. They'll be here soon." And when they arrived, the gates of the garden opened, and they stayed. Some of them just for a day, and those without homes forever. And you and I, we can create gardens. We can go there in our imagination, because some trees give fruit and some do not. Poplar, cypress, apricot, pomegranate, peach and mulberry, apple, quince and sweet cherry.
Oh.
All right. Xanthe, thank you so much. Xanthe Gresham, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. All right, this is the saddest news that I have for you this evening is that's it. There are no more stories, I know. But the good news is there are always more stories.
Yeah.
I will end, I believe I don't have any hardcore people here who will fight me on this, but if you would like to afterwards, that's fine. Line up, let's go. I'd like to end with my own personal philosophy, which I like to share at the end of all of my storytelling sessions, which is, if you have enjoyed the stories that you've heard today,
Oh, yes.
if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, then I would like you all please very much to stay here while we advertise more things to you. Fleur, please come up. Notices, reading out the bands. We have,
Sorry, I just didn't want to.
we of course.
Did you have a lovely rousing end?
I did.
and
Go.
didn't want
Go.
to-
Do you want to
Okay,
interrupt, Fleur?
that-
Is that what it was?
I am a bossy teacher, so I'm used to doing that. So, okay, Rewilding Cinderella is going to be a big extravaganza at the Waterhall Rewilded Golf Course, which is near Brighton. And it's going to happen on the 28th and 29th of May. And there's going to be a fabulous walk. It's going to take about 2 hours. We've been putting it together since January. 13 storytellers, 13 different versions of Cinderella. So it's just going to be wonderful. So have a look on the Brighton Fringe website for the link and you can book tickets. It's not totally accessible, so if you'd like to come to the accessible performance, there's going to be one on Onker Barge in Brighton Marina on the 4th of June, and there's going to be an online version for all those international people on the 2nd of June. Yeah. Okay, so that's Rewilding Cinderella. And our club, Lunarsea Storytelling Club, on the 30th of May, we are having a fundraiser for Ukraine. And so we've got at least one student from Varndine College who says they're going to come and tell a story. I know a wonderful, young person coming along from Varndine Sixth Form College. It's wonderful that they're going to be there. And music, and Nana Tomova is going to be there, and lots of other delights. So we'd really like you to welcome you all to that. And also on the 28th of June, Lisa Schneidau is telling the World Tree, and that's going to be absolutely fabulous.
Where's that?
Okay. Well, it might be at Varndine College, but it might be online, or it might be actually at the event Grand Central Pub, which is opposite.
Where else might it be?
Yeah, so it's the Nightingale Room in the Grand Central Pub opposite Brighton Station, and that's where it's going to be on the 30th of May as well.
Amazing.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay. Any more? Anyone got any kids they want to bring? Okay.
It's birthdays next.
And a big clown costume, it's like
My
a panther.
birthday today.
Oh no, it isn't. It's your birthday today. Happy birthday! Congratulations. Thank you very much. 25. Nearly 24. Okay, so I'm gonna round us off. I'm gonna call out the evening, and I'm going to say, if you have enjoyed these stories, they do not belong to us. They now belong to you. Now that you've heard them, they live in your brain. Please take them forwards. Tell them badly. Tell them better. If you have been moved by anything, know that it is yours, because stories are the collective commonwealth of humanity. They are our guide to the past and our roadmap to the future, and we forget our strong and powerful oral traditions at our peril. Please continue telling stories, please continue coming to the wonderful Ropetackle Storytellers, and please give a wonderful round of applause for all of our brilliant tellers this evening. Thank you very much, everybody! Thank you all for turning up. Thank you, I'll see you all next month. Good night!